Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, our webinar, a third in a series on our legal case updates. I'm Leanne O'Neill. I'm the Managing Director of Legal Advocacy for FAIR, and I'm pleased to introduce to you Tara Gustilo, a physician who is a plaintiff in a lawsuit that FAIR has supported since 2021, and her counsel, Daniel Cragg. And we have a really good program planned for you today where we're going to go through the facts of what Dr. Gustilo experienced in her workplace, what inspired her to take the brave step in bringing a lawsuit against her employer. And we will hear from Daniel about the legal ins and outs of this case and what we are looking forward to coming down the pike as this litigation progresses. First, I want to go ahead and introduce both of our guests here today more formally. Dr. Gustilo has been a physician for 30 years. She's a board-certified OBGYN, as well as an acupuncturist. She has extensive educational background. She graduated from Harvard-Radcliffe with a degree in comparative religions and then went to the Mayo Clinic where she'd received her medical degree. She did her internship and residency in obstetrics and gynecology at Duke University and received her master's in public health from the University of North Carolina. She's also received additional training in acupuncture from UCLA. She's devoted her entire career to providing care and assisting underserved populations. Incidentally, she is the mother of Black children, and she is of Filipino descent herself, which I think that we'll hear from her and the way that her background and experience has been impacted and influenced the way that she's gone forward with this lawsuit. She worked for Hennepin Healthcare in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is the defendant in the lawsuit. Hennepin is a safety net hospital, so that health system cares for a wide range of patients of all different backgrounds and demographics. Moving on to Daniel Cragg. Dan is one of the attorneys within our FAIR legal network. He is a litigator and trial lawyer with focus in commercial litigation and employment law, admiralty law, and maritime law, and has experience in filing claims against all levels of government. He's one who believes in the importance of civil society and has always participated in bar, professional, and trade associations. For years, he has watched as the illiberal ideologues have installed themselves in classically liberal organizations and claimed the mantle to diversity and inclusion. In 2020, his curiosity morphed into genuine concern when organizations, leadership expected the leadership expected of those organizations for its members elevated new anti-liberal principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion over the fundamental values of his profession, which are free speech, equality under the law, due process, and the search for the truth. Daniel joined the FAIR Legal Network to fight for those fundamental values in the context of public and private employment and for violations of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and in public employment and other claims against government for violating the United States Constitution. He's a partner with the Minneapolis-based law firm of Eklund and Blando and associates with other jurisdictions throughout the United States as well. He currently represents Dr. Gustilo in her claims against Hennepin Healthcare System. And we'll put the link to the chat in the chat. There is a webpage on FAIR's website dedicated to Dr. Gustilo's case where you can read more information about that if you're interested later. So let's kick this off here. I just wanted to begin, Dr. Gustilo, with you with really the beginnings of what you experienced at Hennepin. And I think that one thing that's really characteristic of a lot of the cases that we work on is that a lot of the things started to go sideways in 2020. And it sounds like that is similar to what you experienced as well and consistent with that. You'd started at HHS in 2008, though. You had various leadership positions. So if you could give us more insight into your background and what your roles were in terms of the leadership positions you had at the health system and the kind of endeavors that you sought to take up while you were in those positions.
So yeah, I came to Hennepin in 2008. I just came as an OBGYN and acupuncturist, and during my tenure there, I was on almost every major committee. I was on the quality committee, I was on the physician development committee, I was on the medical executive committee, I was on the board of the hospital. There were two physicians on the board, and I was one of them. And I also ran the quality committee for the board, rotating off when my term expired right before I left. Um, and the so I had joined there. I was as soon as I got there, there was a lot of things that could have been improved, and so I started working on those improvements in our clinic, trying to organize schedules in such a way that people could have continuity of care, starting to create spaces that were maybe a little bit more friendly for our patients with artwork and books in the waiting room. I mean, just kind of some basic things. Um, and then as part of my work with the quality committee, of course, starting to look at the systems in place and what can we do to improve our care on a bigger level. Um, and so starting to, like, while I was on the board quality committee, starting to look at care from the lens of, let's look at it from race, let's look at it from socioeconomics, let's look and see if there's differences there. Um, I think one of the areas that I maybe viewed it a little differently and had discussions about, which maybe we'll get into later, is, I don't think disparities are necessarily because of bad care. For instance, let's talk about mammograms. If there's a disparities in the number of women who are at the right age for mammograms, is it because they're not being offered mammograms, or is there a cultural bias against mammograms? And, do we respect our patients in that way? Right. And so I think that for me, it's a very interesting area when you're talking about providing care and healthcare to people, because you're balancing science with autonomy and people's preferences, and trying to understand that better. So that, kind of going, and then the last thing is I became interim chair of the OBGYN department in 2015. And then also then became permanent chair some 3 or 4 years later. Um, at, and so I was running that department when all of the kind of things that led to my removal happened. Um,
And maybe we should throw in that HHS thought so highly of her. I mean, they put her on a billboard in downtown Minneapolis as the face of Hennepin Healthcare System.
yeah.
That
So
does say a
yeah,
lot. So,
we go ahead. I'm
oh no,
sorry.
go ahead, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I'm actually really proud of the work that I did at Hennepin and what we accomplished. Because of an example, because of budget cuts, we had lost our doulas. Um, and very quickly thereafter, I worked with my department and our foundation to start a foundation to get funded, and we got donations to get our doulas up and running again. Um, we started kind of going into 2020, we had started looking at care of our minority populations in particular, because the community health assessment had shown nothing new, but for a long time, there's been health disparities in outcomes between African American, Native American women and white women. And
So as
so
part of your work, kind of figuring out why those disparities were there, I mean, did you get to a place where you had special insights given your leadership position into why that might be happening in your community?
So what we decided to do was we engaged in some pilots, what I believe to be pilots, which now seem to have morphed into maybe a segregated care model, but pilots to try and understand what was going on with those two communities in particular. And so it was a culturally congruent care model, meaning that the providers of that model were going to be, in these pilots, were going to be people of the same race, or at least there would be a majority of people of the same race in those pilots. The goal, my understanding of the goal when we started, was to gain understanding of what the barriers were to our care, what the perceptions were that were maybe barriers to women coming into getting care, and then also to create a multicultural care model that would use the learnings from these individuals, kind of more segregated models, to create a more comprehensive model that would encompass the learnings, but not be exclusive to one race or another. And in fact, my, kind of as the chair of the department, what I had laid out was, we're going to start with these two groups because the greatest disparities are there and there was funding available. And so it seemed like a natural place to start. But my goal was to then focus in on different populations after we did that initial pilot, do a similar thing to understand kind of what would be barriers to other populations, to Hispanic or Latinx populations, or to the Somali populations, and then try and understand, how do you create a care model that is truly comfortable as best we can to any and all who are coming to seek care, right? With the idea that we have to, no matter what my race is as a doctor or a clinician, I have to be able to relate to the person in front of me. And so can we gain learnings that will help all of us have better skills for whoever comes through our door?
And so how was that program received by your coworkers at the time? And what year was that? Were those programs?
So this would have been this would have been like 2019, 2018, 2019 is when these things started kind of rolling. In fact, we were just about to launch our first African-American kind of pilot of this kind of culturally congruent care model, like right when COVID hit. And so it got shut down. So we had done some focus groups. We felt like we had a pretty good understanding from those focus groups. But even as we were going in, right before, as we were kind of about to launch that pilot, I recognized that I was maybe understanding what was happening a little differently. I recall in one meeting, one of my colleagues who was helping with the pilot said something about how, because I had referred to the fact that, hopefully we'll get good learnings and we can create a more comprehensive multicultural care, system. And she kind of implied that probably, it would probably take 50 years before Black women would feel comfortable in a multicultural care model or whatever. And I thought to myself, whoa, this is different than what I was thinking. Around the same time, kind of as we were going into this same time frame, like we had also launched a culturally congruent for African-American women, for Black women, doula pilot. And this came again through, it kind of naturally happened. There was funding, there was a doula group that was interested, and we were going to kind of hopefully make this happen. And this was kind of early, right around the whole COVID, as everything was happening. And again, I recall in a meeting, they were talking about they wanted to find a community health worker. Within the system, there wasn't one who was Black, and they were talking about how, as they were trying to post the position, there was issues because of, segregation laws, right? That you can't kind of post a job saying you have to be this or that, very specifically. And so there was this kind of discussion about how to deal with that issue. And I remember going, what are we talking about? Are we talking about segregated care here? Like, yeah, we should have some people representative of these groups, but does the whole team have to be? Isn't our goal to have it become a good care model that anyone can feel comfortable in? And so those are kind of things early on that I realized, wow, I'm clearly what I thought we were working on has either I was mistaken at the beginning, but I feel like more it kind of shifted as we started getting into it.
And then arguably things really shifted in the spring of 2020. Like I said, we're really familiar with there sort of being a hard turn taken by a lot of institutions during that time. And so I'm curious, what was the first indication you had of, something like these care programs taking a very dramatic turn away from what you had understood them to be originally intended to do?
Well, it's interesting, these care programs, because of COVID, right? Most of them got put on hold at this point, right? And so we had been working on them. We were about to launch them. COVID kind of shut them all down, at least for a while. And so the shift that I kind of experienced was more with my group, and I can give a couple of examples. So right after the George Floyd incident, my team came to me and said they wanted to write a letter just expressing support for our community, because obviously our community had a lot of rioting, a lot of areas had been kind of destroyed. And I thought that was a great idea. They started writing the letter, and in that letter, this became a huge thing. I didn't even think it would be, but it became a huge thing. They wanted to include the term that we supported them in their unrest. And this is right after riots. And I just said, I don't feel comfortable signing a letter, because unrest has kind of been a code word in the media for what has been protests, but also some violent protests. And I just don't feel like that's appropriate. And this became a huge kind of wedge between me and my department, just this one word. And so I, to the point that I said, you can send this letter, but you can't say it's from our department. You can sign it individually and acknowledge you're from our department. But I don't, as someone in the department, I don't feel comfortable having my name associated with a letter with that terminology in it. It sounds small, but I didn't think I was surprised it was an issue, became an issue. Like, we can find a different word, right? But that was kind of one kind of wedge between me and my department. And then we had some of my docs in my department wanted to do a kind of a sit-in or something to show kind of just the sorrow around what was going on. And it ended up getting picked up by White Coats for Black Lives. And
Could
there
you
was
just could you tell the attendees and listeners today about what you know about that organization, what that is?
So it's associated with Black Lives Matter. And so what I will say is prior to this, it was basically a sit-in or at the Capitol. Initially, my docs had said they just wanted to do it. They said, oh, White Coats for Black Lives has been picked up, wants to pick this up. Our organization, Hennepin Healthcare, had made it very clear that we were not supposed to align as a department with anything kind of political like that. And so I said, that's fine, but we can't really, obviously you can work on this, but we can't be officially aligned with this. So White Coats for Black Lives has a very similar platform to Black Lives Matter, and which I actually did not realize before I went to the sit-in. As we were there, they started talking about defunding the police and things that I felt very uncomfortable with. And And then at the very end, they actually acknowledged my department and Hennepin Healthcare for their help in that, in creating that event, which was kind of, had it been explicitly said, we can't do this. So after that event, I had written my team and I said, that event, it was very well attended. I said, obviously you guys put a lot of work into this. You should be proud. My concern is that we were acknowledged in this event and we weren't supposed to be. And and not only did Hennepin Healthcare say we weren't supposed to be, but I included the fact that, and the reason we're not supposed to acknowledge is because I was uncomfortable with that alignment, right? I mean, and so even people within our own department are uncomfortable with that. I think it's prudent for us as a medical system not to publicly be aligning with a political organization. Mm-hmm. This became again, a very big wedge that I was, seeing this differently. We had meetings about it. I said, okay, guys, of course, I believe Black Lives Matter. I believe people's lives matter, but I do support a family structure. I'm not a communist or a socialist. So it's not the tagline, it's kind of the platform this organization has that I think is problematic. And I think it's better for us as a medical system to kind of try and be apolitical. That was not well received, I guess is what I would say.
And so around the same time, I think that you had kind of expressed your own feelings about a lot that was going on, around society, in our culture, in your own private social media accounts. And if you could just give us a little bit of background about that, because that obviously became a big part of what you experienced next.
So yeah, one of the things after George Floyd's death, I became very interested. I did some research and got kind of the statistics on what was really the level of kind of unarmed deaths for both Black and white people by police. And I kind of realized that it seems like the media had been promoting a notion that wasn't kind of accurate with what I was understanding to be the statistics. Mm-hmm. And so that was kind of an eye-opening thing. It led to me kind of looking at some other things. And so I did start posting kind of what I was finding and thinking and like, hey, do you guys know that only 18 unarmed people were shot? And, what does this mean that our media is making us feel like it's so much more? So I started posting that. Now, what had happened is, so when COVID had hit, we needed to move to virtual care, a virtual care model. And so I was trying to figure out how we could get that done, and especially in OB and in pregnancy. And what I realized is we needed thermometers and we needed blood pressure cuffs. If women could do that at home, we could do quite a bit of their care. If we could get them those things, we could do quite a bit of care virtually because we didn't know what COVID was at that point, right? Mm-hmm. And there was no money for it. We had no money for blood pressure cuffs or thermometers. And so I was trying to figure out how to get it. So I talked to our foundation. I said, do we have a foundation for our department? They said, yes, like a fund that people can give money to. They said, yes. So I wrote a letter and I posted it on my Facebook and I made it public because I wanted to try and reach people so we could get the funding, which happily, very quickly, we did get funding. So that was great. And so we were able to move on with that care model. What I didn't realize, and so was that when I started posting my thoughts, right, some of those were going public because I had shifted that setting on my Facebook. And honestly, I'm not a super tech savvy person. So that was something that I wasn't really aware of. And And then also one of my partners was a Facebook friend, right? So she was seeing some of my posts. And so between those two things, I got a call from my boss and said, you've posted some things that have upset some people. And I said, oh, well, no one's said anything to me, right? And they requested that I make my Facebook private, which I did immediately. But things kept kind of worsening between me and my colleagues.
And so when did was that kind of the beginning of what you remember being the formal investigation, or, for Hennepin looking closely at your behavior? And had you ever experienced any problems at work before that would have, given the leadership there any reason to, pay you this extra attention?
No, I mean, up until that point, I hadn't really had any issues. A few years before, there had been a patient who was actually Nigerian who had refused to be taken care of by a Nigerian doctor. And so there had been an issue over that. And kind of we had discussion within our department about, do we let patients refuse care based on immutable characteristics? Now, it's interesting in OB because women refuse care from men in OB not infrequently, right? So there's kind of this, so it was a conversation. There's people who felt strongly about it on both ends. I actually took it to my executive leadership and asked them for a policy around this that wasn't really forthcoming. And so that was probably one of the main issues I had with that. But
But you
otherwise,
obviously
not
had this
really.
exemplary career there so far.
Yeah,
You've been
I mean,
appointed
basically
to
up
every
until this,
committee available, all that.
right. I mean, up until this point, my evaluations were all, out of 5, 4.5 5s, right? I had been on and chaired a lot of the major committees in the hospital. And so really hadn't had any issues at all. The folks in my department, I mean, it was very interesting because once I learned about this, I felt badly. And so I sought to just go and talk with the people in my department and say, hey, there were these concerns. I was very quickly told I couldn't talk to anyone, that was abusive to talk with people of my department about what their concerns were. And they decided to hire a consultant. And the kind of
Maybe Tara, let me jump in here. So they did not hire like an HR investigator. They brought in I believe a workplace culture consultant to essentially do a survey and come up with some work product to sort of diagnose and give the department a path back towards, a more harmonious workplace. And despite it not being an investigation, really not being about employment misconduct, the result of the culture survey was to suspend Dr. Gustilo. And completely do a 180 on the purpose of that, have an organization that really wasn't set up to do any type of investigation. But what they found through surveying people is, I think it's accurate to say Dr. Gustilo was caught up in a moral panic in her department and really the culture writ large. She was dissenting from the new orthodoxy, and it triggered an immune response where they essentially wanted her to go for expressing opinions that would have been fairly conventional about 2 minutes ago.
Understood. And so tell everyone what exactly happened. I mean, with your leadership role in your department, and otherwise.
So, for me, I think one of the things that was hardest is they kind of silenced me. I wasn't allowed to really speak to my department, and I guess it's at this point, it's not surprising, but at the time it surprised me. I said, it's what, 20 people or whatever in my department. And they said it would be too traumatizing for them to sit down and talk with me, like one person with 20 other, like that. To me, it was just like, I don't even understand what you're saying, right? I mean, that's such a weird, at that point, clearly I had no ability to harm them as far as to fire them or demote them or give them bad assignments, and so it was really just the concept of having to sit and listen and have a conversation that they felt would be too traumatic, which I guess interesting is the word I would use there. To answer to your question, though, is, they basically said, we want you to resign. I said, I don't feel like I should resign. I haven't changed my leadership style at all. And even after kind of issues came up. So one of the ways in general that as a leader, what I did is I usually would ask my team to vote on things, and I would throw things to them and I would say, okay, this is the situation. What do you guys think? And then if needed be, we would do a poll, right? And so I'd continue to do that. I'd continue to work on the same things I'd been working on before. And so I had declined to resign. And so through a series of events, they eventually took me out of my position. I told them who amongst my colleagues would probably be the best person to follow, if to run the department. And she was indeed the one that they put in that position. I gave her as much information as I could, and then I continued to work as just a clinician in the department after that.
So you went from being the chair of your department to being a member of your department, on the basis of the other leadership in the institution feeling like this was not going to work going forward.
Right.
And I guess that brings me to, I guess, Daniel and his role in this. That demotion would be our adverse employment action, if we're engaging in the legal speak. So Dan, please go ahead and tell us, when did you first come across this case, and how did it proceed as you got involved?
Sure. So I think we came in the spring of 21 after Dr. Gustilo had been demoted. And we first made a charge on her behalf with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is a mandatory stop if you're going to bring a Title VII employment discrimination claim. And maybe before I get into that, I do want to say, Leanne, you mentioned the courage that Dr. Gustilo had to bring a lawsuit, but I also just want to remind everyone what it was like in 2020. There was overwhelming pressure on everyone with a job in the professional managerial class to conform to this new orthodoxy. And most people kept quiet and kept their heads down. And Dr. Gustilo had the courage to speak out when almost nobody else was. And not only did she speak out on these issues around race, I mean, she was also early on talking about COVID issues and China's involvement, things that right now are regarded as the truth, that there was perhaps a lab leak origin of COVID. They were decrying her as racist for just raising the question. So she was early on these things, spoke out with a lot of courage, and she's continued to be courageous, telling her story today and also going forward with this lawsuit. So the case was parked at the EEOC for about 180 days, where we requested a right to sue letter before they finished their investigation, could get it into court. We brought a First Amendment retaliation claim on the basis of her private Facebook posts, which were clearly part of the basis for her demotion. There was largely an admission from HR representatives that was a trigger for her demotion. We also brought Title VII race discrimination claim. The theory largely being that this ideology flattens people into their racial groups along with their viewpoints, that there is one monolithic viewpoint for someone who is of Asian descent. And so when she deviated from that viewpoint, again, triggers this immune response. She can't exist in this space as something that is not in keeping with the new truth, essentially. We also brought a retaliation claim because she was advocating against the racially segregated care and advocating for fairly standard, classically liberal principles of non-discrimination, not treating people as individuals rather than groups. And we brought some state law claims under the Minnesota Human Rights Act that are just really parallel to the Title VII retaliation and discrimination claims. There was no motion to dismiss brought out of the gate. And I'll say this was defended by the Hennepin County Attorney's Office because Hennepin Healthcare is a county hospital. We proceeded through discovery. And there was, the HHS wouldn't admit the ultimate question, essentially, that the reason we fired her was discriminatory, but there was a lot of agreement, essentially, on the facts as to what happened. That they did have a department, that was mostly young and mostly white, who was up in arms over Dr. Gustilo's views, both those expressed privately and also those views that we still were protected in employment. We finished discovery and had a summary judgment motion brought by HHS. And I'll point out we had one judge during the whole case, Judge Susan Richard Nelson, she's a good judge. She is probably regarded by the plaintiff's employment bar as one of the more friendly judges to a plaintiff's employment discrimination case on the federal bench here in Minnesota. But as you can probably guess, our case has a bit of a political valence that I think we all kind of knew along the way that she would not be a huge fan of. And I was reminded in our summary judgment briefing that I said as much on the Megyn Kelly podcast. It's always fun when your opponent can quote how we're excited to get up to the Eighth Circuit in your summary judgment briefing. And so we fully briefed everything and went in for a hearing. And Judge Nelson, she wasn't hostile, but she was not very interested in our legal theories. She focused very much on, is there a case that's essentially your exact same factual scenario? Or what's your analogy here? And my main point was look at all the stereotype cases. If you have a case where a woman is fired for behaving in a stereotypically masculine fashion, and we all agree, we agree, I mean, cases going back 40 years or more, that is sex discrimination. Well, we have the race-based version of this. She expressed views that they don't regard as acceptable for a woman of Asian descent. And that was why she was terminated. We also had kind of a nuanced issue on the First Amendment First Amendment claim, in that to sue an entity for a First Amendment violation, you have to show that the entity's final policymaking authority either committed the violation or ratified or approved it. And in this case, HHS has a board of directors who did ratify and approve Dr. Gustilo's termination. There was an intermediate committee called the Medical Executive Committee that essentially heard her out, had a 90-page packet full of things, full of emails talking about, why she needs to go, including her personal Facebook posts and things like that. And the MEC, or Medical Executive Committee, voted to demote her. And then that goes up to the board of directors. And we had a deposition of HHS as an entity, where they essentially admitted, yes, the board of directors ratified the MEC's decision and the basis for it. That should be the end of it right there. We've got an admission that the final policymaking authority ratified and approved the decision that we claim is unconstitutional. But Judge Nelson said, no, that's a pretty slender reed to hang your hat on for saying that the board of directors actually ratified the decision.
Interesting. Okay, let me
Interesting,
stop
yeah.
you there before we go on to the next, what's happened, or what will be happening next. One of the questions we have from one of our attendees, is with respect to the Facebook account where you'd made the post, Dr. Gustilo. Was that was your private account? How did you identify yourself in your profile there? And if you want to chime in, Dan, and just kind of give your take on what amount of privacy and, can employers come in and just fire people for what they say on their private social media accounts?
So on my kind of little personal blurb, there was nothing about my employment or anything like that. The one thing is my initial public post, I did identify as chair because I was asking for money for these blood pressure cuffs and things like that. And then as soon as it was made kind of aware to me that my posts were public, I had figured out how to shut that off. And then I put the disclaimer they had requested, and I have no problem putting a disclaimer that these thoughts are my own. Obviously, what I say as an individual does not reflect on my institution or any of my colleagues. So I put some sort of disclaimer like that on. But yeah, otherwise I didn't, like, as I was writing my post, I wasn't like, I am, working here, or I didn't really say anything about that.
Okay.
Yeah, and Dr. Stillo, I think, removed that poster, removed the part about identifying as being with HHS after management essentially came down on her for it. So it became very clear that it was just her personal Facebook account. And also, to the extent complaints were continuing to be made about her personal Facebook account, the members of her department were going out and looking for it, looking for something to be offended by. So on the law, I think it's fair for a public employer to say, you, in this circumstance, you identified yourself as speaking for the organization, and you need to take that down, or I'd say it's lawful for them to control a public employee who is speaking in their capacity as a public employee, because the government can only act through people. It cannot tell that same public employee what to express in their private off-the-job speech, generally speaking. Now, there can be circumstances where the speech becomes so disruptive that it undermines the mission of the public organization, but it's an exceedingly high bar, and that certainly wasn't anywhere in our facts here. And indeed, HHS never claimed that. They never claimed that it was disruptive to the point where they would be lawfully permitted to retaliate against her for that. What they said was her private speech had absolutely nothing to do with this decision, again, despite the fact that everybody was complaining about it, and those complaints are what triggered this whole process.
Interesting. And so what's the next step here? And what is the timeline?
So you probably know where I was going on this, in that Judge Nelson dismissed the entire case, which, like I said, not surprising. I would say our legal theories here are not novel, but the facts are sort of novel, just in that, the world changed quite a bit in 2020, and the cases are still catching up to it. So in the face of novel facts, Judge Nelson decided to dismiss on summary judgment and send us up to the Eighth Circuit, where we are hopeful. We're going to get a panel that is very receptive to the claims that we've brought, and they'll reverse Judge Nelson, and we'll get remanded to go to trial on this.
And so what will that look like exactly?
Sure. So our brief is actually due, I believe, on Friday. So we're coming up on our principal appellate brief. HHS will have 30 days after that to respond. We'll have a couple weeks after that to file a reply brief, and then we wait to be put on the oral argument panel. It might be a while. It could be we don't have one for 9 months or something like that, and they'll take their time. The federal courts don't have any statutory deadlines to render an opinion. But I would hope probably this time next year we have a decision from the Eighth Circuit, we'll be headed back down to the trial court for a trial.
Amazing. So Dr. Gustilo, Daniel mentioned, the bravery that you've exhibited in even speaking up, voicing your opinion on the different matters at hand, just in society and culture writ large in 2020. Can you just tell us a little bit about where does that courage come from? Why did you feel like did you feel that you were maybe in a particularly good position to express beliefs that might be contrary to what seemed to be the popular ideas, at least?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was more of an issue. I don't know if it was bravery as much as I just looked at it and I'm like, wow, this is something really is wrong is happening. And, at that point, you were hearing about people getting fired for speaking up, right? And things like that. And I looked at my situation. I'm a daughter of an immigrant, and a farmer. My mom's was from a small town, Schaefer, Minnesota, farmer's daughter, and my dad was a Filipino immigrant who lived the American dream. I have 3 children who are perceived as Black in our society. I have worked I worked on the Navajo reservation. I've worked with underserved populations basically my entire life. And so I've kind of felt like I'm someone who can maybe speak out. I am someone who can maybe say something and maybe be a bridge to what seemed to be 2 very opposing points of view. And, my hope was to be able to say, hey, let's just think about this and talk about this and let's have a conversation around this. I was hoping that I had put in my life experience as well as my who I was, who was in my life, and then also all the years of work I put in would put me in a position where people wouldn't jump to, she's just a racist, or she's just intolerant. And so that was my hope. My hope was like, and I knew there, it was a very odd time. And I just thought to myself, well, if it happens, it's going to happen. But I feel like people have to speak out. And I'm a good candidate to speak out given my life to this point. So that's what I did. And I don't regret it at all. I think I've learned a lot. And I think the topics are still topics that are really important for us to try and have conversations around. And I think we just have to keep trying. To engage both sides of, whatever discussion to try and find a way to have a common ground. And I don't mean to preach, but I mean, I think the other thing is we need to stop assuming malintent or vilifying each other. I mean, we maybe are approaching these things from totally different points of view, but that doesn't mean that one side want bad things to happen to another group, right? I mean, this is just, it's like, no, the way we're understanding the problem is maybe different. And rather than shutting each other down, perhaps we should try and listen, because the truth is probably somewhere in between. The solution is probably somewhere in between. We're clearly not finding solutions by, being on total opposite sides of these discussions. So that was my goal. Initially, it's still my goal, is to engage people in true civil dialogue and discussions.
And you continued working at Hennepin for a while, but could you tell us, what's life for you like now? How has it been being a plaintiff in a lawsuit like this one?
Well, it was one of those things where my career directory changed quite a bit, right? I mean, I was chair of a department. You know, natural steps after being a chair of a department would be either chair at another department or become chief medical officer or CEO, or right. I mean, this is kind of a normal trajectory. You know, honestly, because of everything going on, when I decided to leave Hennepin, you know, initially I wasn't even sure I'd be able to get a job, right? Because what do you need for a job? You need references. And I was in a very tenuous position. So, you know, it's been, fortunately, where I am now is a great organization. I feel supported by my organization. I'm getting to, you know, work with a patient population that I've never worked with, and I've been learning a lot here. You know, being a plaintiff in a lawsuit, it's one of those things where it's stressful. It's hard. I mean, those were hard years for me. And so it's one of those things I don't think about every day, purposely, because it's hard. But I'm also, you know, incredibly grateful to FAIR, incredibly grateful to Dan. I mean, because I do think it's important. I think the lawsuit's an important thing to pursue, because it's a statement saying this isn't, we need to have open dialogue. We can't have the level of intolerance that we're experiencing in society. So.
Right. Yeah, well, you know, thank you so much. I think that it is bravery. It is, you know, a real showing of your courage to stand up and to have brought the EEOC complaint in the first place, to follow up with the lawsuit. Obviously, you were wronged, and it's what we have to do is we have to stand up and fight against intolerance and those who break the law. And so we're very, very thankful. I mean, me personally, just as a human, a fellow American, I'm very thankful to you for doing this. It really takes a lot, I know, and I think that the impact will be great. And before we wrap up, I just kind of wanted to go back over to you, Dan, on that point. You know, what do you see is at stake with this lawsuit?
Well, it's very important. And what I see at stake, if there's kind of a big legal issue or approach, is actually to restore the original intent of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and Title VII, which is employers should not discriminate on the basis of race, full stop. And everything that the courts have layered on top of that, you know, creating these other elements about, you know, must be in a protected class and this or that, and replaced by someone in a certain way, and just needs to get back to the fundamental principle that people should not be treated as members of groups, but should be evaluated on their individual merit.
And so you mentioned the timeline. You expect sometime maybe within the year, you'll be back at it, and this will be being looked at on its merits. And I thought that, I know that we've done this before in other webinars, but if you could give everyone an idea about the expense involved in bringing a lawsuit like this, when you take it, you know, to the bitter end.
Yeah, the expense is huge. You know, there's to take a case like this where you know there's probably going to be an intermediate stop at the Court of Appeals, to actually go and try it. It's hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney's fees, maybe less than 100,000 in costs and things like that. So it's substantial. It's a huge burden to see it through all the way to the end.
Right. And a lot of our viewers may or may not know, but you know, lawsuits like these are where there's obviously the personal harm that was done to the plaintiff, and there is a lot at stake really for all of us. A lot of these lawsuits are funded and platformed by organizations. It's certainly one of the pillars of what FAIR focuses on doing is supporting lawsuits that we think will shape the trajectory going forward and stand up to reaffirm, like Dan said, things like the Civil Rights Act. We have to demonstrate to the world that those principles matter and that they should stand. And so it's our pleasure to support this case and others that really tout similar principles. And we work completely on donations. And so in order to be able to continue supporting this case and others like it, and I can tell you that there's no shortage of potential lawsuits out there. The phone is always ringing. I guess it's not really a phone anymore. It's more like the emails and the coming in through our fairtransparency.org and other avenues where people reach us. But we are very grateful to the public and to our donors and supporters who make donations of any amount to support the work that we do, so that we can see to it that these very important principles and laws are upheld in our not only local communities, but obviously across the country going forward. And so if you feel so inclined, we always appreciate your financial support. Any final words, Dr. Gustilo or Dan, before we wrap up here?
Tara, you want to go first?
Yeah, I would just, again, express my deepest appreciation and thanks to FAIR and to you for spending an hour with me and giving us a chance to talk about what's going on. And yeah, I just very grateful. So thank you.
And I'll echo that. We really appreciate the support from FAIR we've had on platforming what I think is a very important case. I have very high hopes we're going to win at the 8th Circuit and set some good precedent here, and continue the good mission of FAIR.
Thank you. Well, thank you both for your time today. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and hear, what this has been like and what is coming ahead. And so, of course, we will all be closely watching, and everyone can check back at fairforall.org for updates as they come across, and stay tuned. Keep up the good work. Thank you all so much for being here.